Okay, hi. Um, I'm not very good at recording lectures, but I have actually been thinking that this, me being sick and not able to come to this particular lecture, actually gives me the opportunity to give you all more information. And it sounds like from some of your questions that a lot of you really would like some detailed information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually record a number of, I think, smaller videos because I'm doing it through Zoom, and we'll post them in different chunks. And if I can get through it, all my plan is to first talk to you a little bit about Native American cosmology and society before the arrival of Europeans in a kind of general way. There's always choices about what one could say and how one might want to organize such general comments. And so mine is particular, and mine are, come from priorities that I think are important, but there's a lot of other ways that one could do it. And I will be happy to direct you to other videos, movies, books, things like that, to give you other sorts of information. But I'm going to talk to you in a way that organizes things around a few concepts. Then I'm going to end that video, and then I will give a more detailed sort of fast-paced tour through some of the commonalities and important things about the history of the area we call Mesoamerica prior to when the Spaniards arrived. And then I will actually do another little chunk that's specifically on the concept of El Norte, though that's not what the folks at the time called it, but the concept of the North and the concept of outsiders coming in from the North, which is crucial for the history of the people that we now think of as the Aztecs. And so I'm going to linger a little bit on that in its own little video. And then hopefully I can get all this done. Then I'm actually going to go ahead, I think, and record a video on the Andes as well, which was going to be the subject of the following week on Thursday. But I think I'm going to try to post all of these things to allow you all to look at them, and then use class time to look at some images together, talk more about some specific episodes, and be able to answer your questions and respond. And if this works, I may do that for a few weeks as we're getting through some of the formative stuff. I may do the same thing for pre-Columbian era Iberia, and I may even do a couple of things about religious and cultural change in the early 16th century. A lot of you are asking questions about that. And perhaps a couple of, there may be some key times throughout the semester that it's just good for me to give this kind of a old-fashioned lecture, but I think I might do it on video, even though I'm not very good at it on video. And I think the problem with that is you can't interrupt me and ask me questions, but at least it'll be there as a resource. And then I can kind of go over the same information in a more dynamic, interactive way when I do that on Thursday. Sorry, I just got a message. This is the complicated thing about doing this at home. You should get interrupted by various things. So that's my long-winded introduction to what is going to happen now. So today, or at least in this first section, what I want to do is talk about, as I just said, Native American cosmology and society in the pre-colonial era, which is an enormously long time period. And then after that, and I'm going to be thinking about these particular early introductions with more of an eye towards Mesoamerica and Tenochtitlan, which is the big city center of the what we think of as the Aztec Empire, which, because it's a sacred city, it's the sort of central ceremonial city. And I'm going to do the same thing with the Andes. When I talk about the Andes, I'm going to talk about Cusco and the Andes, the Incan Empire, and also, the Andes in general. So all of these subjects are too large for any number of lectures that I'm able to be to present to you. but I want to, and this is a course on colonial Latin America. And so that's the other thing is that this is the subjects of these lectures really ought to have their own course. But what I'm trying to do here is give you a kind of a whirlwind tour and, throw at you a few important concepts that I think are important for understanding what's to come later. And the same thing will be true when I talk about what was going on in Spain before 1492 or around 1492 or whatever, so that you can think about, have these things in mind when you try to explore with me the contact and encounters, devastating as they were, but also generative as they were, because people involved made them so, that we are about to study. Okay, so I want to talk to you about first two kind of conceptual things. First, I'm going to talk to you about the concept of the supernatural and dualism. Those are the two things I'm going to talk to you about right away. And what I want to say about them is that they're really different. These are ways of talking about some really big ontological, epistemological, concepts, conceptual, like framing conceptual perspectives that were extremely different between the people that lived in the Americas before the Europeans arrived and those Europeans that arrived. Sometimes people confuse the perspective of the early modern Europeans that arrived with ours, whoever ours is. But one thing I want to say clearly, and I probably should dedicate its own little lecture to this, maybe I'll even talk about this in class a little bit, is that so many of the ways that we think about all of these concepts, about the word religion, for instance, about the divisions between religion, culture, politics, science, all that sort of thing, even the ways we think about things like race and culture and what's inheritable, even if we're thinking about it in terms of identifying racist ideologies about what's inheritable. So many of the ways that we think about the relationship between the natural world and humans who inhabit it, the way that we think about the natural world and built structures of society, institutions, cultural institutions and physical institutions, etc. So many of those kind of basic things that we don't even realize that we have got going on in our minds, the assumptions that we have, whether we critique them or not. So many of those things actually have their origin in the 19th century. And so it's one of the most complicated things about talking about this era, this early modern era, is that we're looking backwards from, now we aren't 19th century people. Things have changed a lot since then. But so many of the things that we think are old, that we think are, just the way that it is, the way that we think about stuff, really has an origin in a relatively recent time period. And when we look at things before the 18th century, before the 19th century, someday somebody's going to say that about our era, for sure. COVID and, the technology explosion, now the world of AI, the way that it's changing everything. At some point, we are right in the middle of, massive conceptual changes. And in 200 years, people are going to talk about our era the way that I'm talking about the 19th century right now. But for us, we still have inherited so many things from the 19th century, and it makes it really hard to talk about this era. And it makes it particularly hard to talk about the differences between indigenous folks that lived before interactions with Europeans and Europeans that were not 19th century people. So one thing I want to say is that we're going to misunderstand all of them, that the indigenous people who lived before the arrival of Europeans to the continent of the Americas, to the Americas, are as different from the Europeans that lived at that same time as we are from both of them. Another way to say that is that those early modern Europeans are as different from us as they were from indigenous people, and all the ways around. And we have inherited things from both of them in the Americas. So we are not actually more like modern people living in the United States are not more like Europeans of the 16th century than we are Native Americans from prior to that time period. The dominant culture and the structures that shape our world are the result of colonialism, and European Christianity has won out. But those things were shaped at the time that we're talking about through an interaction between extraordinarily diverse cultures on both sides, not one monolithic culture on the European side and one monolithic culture on the Native American side by any means. They were shaped, but the things that, grew, what am I trying to say? The things that seem to have won out were shaped at the time and forged in the context of colonialism. And it was not a foregone conclusion that they would go the way that they went. And what we inherited was not simply what was going on in 16th century Spain and Portugal and all of the world then that was the Iberian world. So this is a whole lot more preamble than I thought I was going to say. But so the concepts of supernatural versus natural and dualism, which I'm going to talk about first. When I say that indigenous folks thought about these things really differently than 16th century Iberians, excuse me, this is the cold. I don't expect that you will relate to the 16th century Europeans. So I want you to just try to trust me that I'm talking about something that was really powerful for them. And in a lot of ways, I think we understand now the perspective in relationship to at least the supernatural natural divide of indigenous folks certainly more than the Europeans at that time, certainly more, because we have been shaped by those perspectives, and also because actually in some ways, some strains of philosophical thought in the 19th century, transcendentalism, Emersonian thought, even particular kinds of Enlightenment thought, were shaped by the encounters with indigenous people and actually emerged from indigenous people. And there's a great book by Bianca Premo, who writes specifically about that, about the Enlightenment of the Americas, the Enlightenment of indigenous people, Enlightenment thought coming from indigenous people, which looks really different from 19th century stuff. Okay, so let me bring it back. Well, one more thing. Sorry. Religion. The word religion. I hear in all of your, or in many of your questions, and this is just so consistent. It's so interesting. It's consistent. It's been consistent for 30 years. People say when they encounter these kinds of primary sources, when they think about the conquest, when they look at this sorts of history, the first thing people start to say they start to identify religious ideas and start to say, this is religion, and start to talk about religion as an epiphenomenon. What do I mean by epiphenomenon? An epiphenomenon is something that is not the main thing. It's not the main cause. It's either something that grows out of or is motivated by something else, or something that might justify the real thing. So in other words, the language that comes through in a lot of y'all's questions is looking at how religion was used for economic or political gains, or looking at how religion justified economic or political gains. So here, politics, money, science, those are the real things that were motivating the world. I'm not saying this is true. This is the way that we think. This is the way we in post 19th century talk about these things. Politics, science, money, these are true things. These are the real motivating factors. Religion is an ideology. It's a system of ideas. It's a system of beliefs. It's something you lay on top of those other real material, concrete things. It's something you use to change people's minds. It's something you use to justify, conquest, to justify the accumulation of wealth, to justify consolidation of power, etc. So the thing I need for you all to try to understand, or to try to just, grok that we really don't get how people prior to the 19th century thought about this. The way I want to interrupt that is to say there was no concept of or understanding of religion as a discrete sphere separate from these other things prior to about the late 18th century in the universe we're talking about, and in a lot of the Western world, certainly not in Native American contexts, but any of the people that we're talking about now didn't even use the word religion the way that we use the word religion. Religión meant specific kinds of practices or specific kinds of concepts. Like in the 16th century started being born the idea of having religion or not having religion. And this was a colonial concept. The idea that when they looked at indigenous people living their lives, solving problems, answering questions about how the natural world was related to human beings, how human beings were a part of the natural world, the debts and obligations that human beings owed to each other, why we're here, what happens after we die, what happens before we die, all these sort of big questions, and ethical questions about how we ought to relate to each other, and how time ought to be organized, and how society ought to be organized, and how birth and death ought to be treated, all those sorts of things. When Iberian people looked at the ways that indigenous people related to those questions, they started to, first of all, they were like, they're not Christian, so they're heathens and they are wrong. That was one thing, but they already knew about people who were heathens and wrong because they had already been, I'm jumping ahead, but we're going to talk about this in a couple of weeks. But they had a long history of dealing with Jewish and Muslim believers, but they understood Jews and Muslims to have religion, just wrong religion. But they didn't talk about it that way. They didn't talk about it with that word. They were people who had not just wrong beliefs, but wrong practices, and also wrong blood. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. But there was a real, genuine notion that literally, not metaphorically, such things that we now call religious, that we now think of as spiritual, as in the realm of beliefs or feelings, maybe rituals and practices, maybe community belonging, but certainly something you can choose to be a part of or not. We think that's how we think about religion. People in the 16th century and before in the European world, thought of those things as inheritable, thought of those things as something passed down in blood. And so when you were a convert, yes, you could convert to Christianity, and you should, according to this conversion mentality of Christianity. But you were always suspect, because those qualities, even if you didn't even remember that you had people in your ancestry who converted from these other cultures, basically, the way that we would think of as cultures or races, and actually they talked about them as raza. And raza, the original Spanish term raza, wasn't neutral. It didn't mean race as in races. To have raza, tener raza, meant that you had a taint in your blood. You were of a bad race. And that was religious. It was what we would call religious. The people that had a bad taint in their blood were not people with dark skin. They were not people from particular parts of the world, although those things got mapped onto it fairly soon. And certainly in the colonial encounter, it became more and more about phenotype and about place. But in the 16th century and earlier, it was about whether you were Muslim or Jewish. And so things that we think of as choices and religion were thought of as intertwined with, at the very least, things that we now think of as biological, genealogical, etc. So that's one thing. So religion was not, in that sense, religion was not something you just chose to be a part of or not. Religion also was not a separate spiritual sphere. That has a concrete history, which we will get into later, that has to do with, in this part of the world anyways, it has to do with the beginning of the Enlightenment. It has to do with the Bourbons, who were a particular dynasty, French dynasty, that inhabited the throne, the Spanish throne, and really tried to implement all these reforms to change the structure of power in Spain's colonies. And one of the ways that they did that was to try to take power away from the church. The church always existed. The church didn't exist as one thing. The Catholic Church we're talking about here. The church was a political universe unto itself, and what existed consisted of many, many different kinds of institutions within it. But in Spain's colonies, and in Europe itself, but particularly in the colonies, the church comes to have a lot of wealth and a lot of political power, and not just political power in a big way, but in a kind of intimate way. People used church courts, people related to church laws differently than they did civil courts and laws, for good reason. People chose to relate to these church institutions in ways that disempowered the crown's power, or lessened the crown's power. And so, and there was a partnership model in the early part of the colonial era where the crown and the church really thought of themselves as mother, father. And we'll talk more about that. I'm getting so ahead of myself here. And the Bourbons tried to restrict that and wanted to restrict that. And in the process of that late 18th century restriction of church power starts to develop this concept of priests as spiritual specialists, the church as having power over a particular part of life, which was related to ethics, which was related to devotion, that still wasn't separation of church and state. And it still wasn't the state saying that religion wasn't real or important, but it was bracketing off the economic, the political from the spiritual. And in this moment, and there was a lot of resistance to it, and it didn't happen overnight. And it took almost the entire 19th century to really solidify. And it took the birth of independent nations and nationalist ideology, which was extremely anti-clerical and anti-church, for the kind of hardening of religion over here and politics over here and science, et cetera, and economics to come into existence. So when we look back at all the stuff that I'm about to talk about and all the stuff that you've been reading, we see it through that lens, and we identify that's religion. That can't really matter as much as the political and the economic, and there seems to be a contradiction between what we think of as religious ethics and religious ideology and the exploitation or the consolidation of power that we see in these political and economic realms. So there must be a justification. Religion is used to do these other things. What I am wanting to suggest to you is that that's not how anybody thought about it back then. That religion, politics, economics were utterly intertwined. Nobody didn't believe in these, people had differing opinions about what we would call religious beliefs, but no one doubted. I mean, maybe that's not true that no one doubted, but it was really, 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 really deeply, deeply, deeply widespread, like as deeply widespread, more deeply widespread, I would say, than the dominant culture idea that germs cause disease. We don't see germs. I mean, we do because we have microscopes and stuff, but like walking around, we trust, this kind of information that experts give us, unless we are the people who are making those discoveries. So things like that's the way that people thought about theology, politics, philosophy, economics. All of those things were deeply, deeply intertwined. Arguably right now, actually, we live in a more fractured time where there's a lot of different alternative truths that people can find evidence for. But at that time, to the best of what historians that I trust and myself think, the way that we separate religion and politics, et cetera, is just not how people thought. Okay, pause. I think I'm going to make that into a preamble, and I'm going to come back and start what I was originally intending to do, because that's already long.